صلوات علی محمد و آل محمد. Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, respected ulama, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight is the eve of the 27th of Muharram, 1445 after the Hijrah. This weekend's majalis have been dedicated to commemorating the martyrdom of our fourth Imam, Imam Ali ibn al-Hussein, Zainul Abidin, alayhi salam. Tonight's program will begin with the recitation of Salam and Marsiya by Brother Samar Abbas. The Majlis will be addressed by our visiting scholar, Dr. Shayk Faiyaz Jaffer of New York. After Majlis, there will be Matam and Noha will be recited by the Shabab al-Mehdi group. And the program will conclude with Ziyarat. Let us begin the program. Please welcome Brother Samar Abbas to the podium, to the masjid here, for recitation of Salam and Marsiya. Please welcome him with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
ایک مرتبہ اور سلوات پڑھیں. چار مصروں سے آغاز کرتا ہوں. نہ کبھی رنجو مہن سے نکلا آب نہ کبھی رنجو مہن سے نکلا تو بس شکر دہن سے نکلا تو بس شکر دہن سے نکلا. بیمار نے پہنی جو ہی کالی بیمار نے پہنی جو ہی کالی پوشاک سب نے جانا کہ ہے چاند گہن سے نکلا آب. سلام کے چند شعر پیش خدمت ہیں. حسینی فکر و تدبر دکھا گئے سجاد. حسینی فکر و تدبر دکھا گئے سجاد، دل نفاق پہ بجلی گرا گئے سجاد، دیار کرب و بلا سے دیار شام تلک، دیار کرب و بلا سے دیار شام تلک، پیام دل بر زہرا سنا گئے سجاد، پیام دل بر زہرا سنا گئے سجاد، ہو کربلائے مولا کے شام کی منزل، ہو کربلائے مولا کے شام کی منزل، فصاحتوں کے سمندر بہا گئے سجاد، فصاحتوں کے سمندر بہا گئے سجاد، ہر ایک صاحب ایمان پہ شکر لازم ہے، ہر ایک صاحب ایمان پہ شکر لازم ہے، عبادتوں کا سلیقہ سکھا گئے سجاد، عبادتوں کا سلیقہ سکھا گئے سجاد، لہو لہو تھے قدم راہ گزر میں خاروں سے، لہو لہو تھے قدم راہ گزر میں خاروں سے، مگر حسینی تحمل دکھا گئے سجاد، ردائے بنت علی سر سے چھن گئی تھی مگر، ردائے بنت علی سر سے چھن گئی تھی مگر، معیار صبر کو چادر بنا گئے سجاد، اور جھلس رہے تھے سمر دھوپ سے نقوش وفا، جھلس رہے تھے سمر دھوپ سے نقوش وفا، مثال ابر زمانے پچھا گئے سجاد حسینی فکر تدبر دکھا گئے سجاد صلوات فاتحہ. ہوئے اسیر بلا میں جو سید سجاد، ہوئے اسیر بلا میں جو سید سجاد، یتیم و بے کس و بے آشنا پہ تھی بیدار، نظر نہ آتا تھا ایک شخص بھی پائے امداد، نگاہ یا سے تکتے تھے چار سو ہر بار، نگاہ یاس سے تکتے تھے چار سو ہر بار، جفاگروں نے جفا بے شمار کی ہے، نہ قدر سید عالی وقار کی ہے، نہ قدر سید عالی وقار کی ہے، یہ ظلم ڈھایا شہری کے ہائے دل بر پر، تمام عمر ہوئی کہ روتے روتے بسر نہ باقی رہ گیا، ہائے کوئی بھی یاور لہو بہاتے تھے آنکھوں سے، حال تھا اب تر لہو بہاتے تھے آنکھوں سے، حال تھا اب تر، پدر کے آگے بھی سجاد تھے بہت بیمار، پڑے تھے بستر غم پر بحالتے ناچار، ترس نہ کھاتا تھا لاغر پہ کوئی ظلم شیار، جہاں سے اٹھ گئے تھے سارے ہی جابر و انصار، جہاں سے اٹھ گئے تھے سارے ہی جابر و انصار، رے کریں جفا پہ جفا کس طرح نہ بانیے شر، حسین مر گئے ہیں کوئی اب نہیں سر پر، حسین مر گئے ہیں اب کوئی نہیں سر پر، ارے عزیز و سینوں سر پیٹ اٹھ گئے سجاد، یتیم ہو گئے باقر ہوئی نئی بیداد، پچھاڑے کھاتے ہیں لاش پہ بادل ناشاد، یہ رو کے کہتے ہیں پہ ہم کہ ہم हुए बर्बाद, ये रो के कहते हैं हम कि हम हुए बर्बाद। तमाम उम्र न चैन आपको मिला कुछ भी, ये सब्र था न किसी का, गिला किया कुछ भी, ये सब्र था ना किसी का, गिला किया कुछ भी, हुए असीर। सलवात पर मोहम्मद वाले।
MashaAllah, for Samar Abbas' uncle, for his health, his safety, and continued blessings. Please recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Before we move on with the rest of the program, some important community announcements. Number one, a community member would like to offer a very special gift to the winner of a raffle draw for the benefit of Bayt al-Ilm. The raffle is for a beautifully crafted ring made of the blessed stone from the grave of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Tickets are $50 and the drawing for the raffle will take place at the conclusion of Ayyam-e Azha. For more information, please contact Sister Fatima Walji. Our annual Arba'een food drive is going on. It is being sponsored by Bayt al-Ilm Academy Sunday School. As we remember the thirst and hunger of the family of the Prophet, let's help those who are less fortunate in our own communities. As Shayk Faiyaz Jaffer said yesterday, that it is not enough for us to just mourn over the Ahlul Bayt, but it is also our duty to help those in our community, just as Imam Sajjad did. There are boxes at the main entrance where you can drop your donations. You can donate non-perishable food as well as personal hygiene items. We are looking for youth volunteers, and if you'd like to help out with the food drive, please email the Sunday School administration at baytalilm@gmail.com. Every Saturday, we do have a ladies and girls Muharram Majlis. It's held at 11 a.m. and it will be going on every Saturday through September 23rd. The majalis are in English and are being addressed by Khanum Maryam Ali Tahir. If you're interested in reciting, visit the Bayt al-Ilm website, select the women's programs section, and complete the sign-up form under that tab. Tonight's sponsors are the families of Brother Asif Hussain and Sister Maliha, and Brother Waqar Hussain and Sister Saima. They request that you remember the marhumeen of your families and the marhumeen of their families. In particular, Mukhtar Hussain Shah, Nasira Mukhtar, Bibi Kaniz Kulsum, and Dawood Hamdani. Please remember all the marhumeen with the Surah Fatiha, preceded by a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Tonight's Majlis will be addressed by Dr. Shayk Faiyaz Jaffer. Dr. Shayk Faiyaz Jaffer is the research scholar for the Islamic Center at New York University and an associate chaplain for the Center of Global and Spiritual Life at NYU. He holds a doctorate in education from New York University with a focus on the identity development of Shia youth in the United States. Pursuing the classical course of Islamic education, he also studied at the Seminary of Karbala in Iraq. This is one of the most prominent centers for Islamic learning. As a faith leader and social activist, Dr. Shayk Jaffer has lectured at various universities, seminars, and workshops across the United States, Canada, Europe, East Africa, and the Middle East. As a highly sought-after lecturer and religious leader, he regularly leads prayer services and making strides in the greater New York area by taking part in several interfaith seminars and discussions with the goal of increasing dialogue with other faith leaders. In 2019, Dr. Shayk Jaffer co-founded Pillars of Peace. This is a non-profit established, it is a non-profit with he established in order to address a gap in appropriate services for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence from all backgrounds, and in particular within the Muslim community. In addition to his roles at NYU's Islamic Center, Dr. Shayk Jaffer serves as the Adjunct Assistant Professor of Public Service of NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, where he teaches courses on Islamic law and Islamic spirituality, and his research has appeared in academic journals. On behalf of the Baitul Ilm community, I want to thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to address the community this weekend. We wish him safe travels back to New York. For the Shaykh, for his family, for their health, safety, and continued blessings, please recite as-salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Muhammad wa ali. As we welcome Shayk Faiyaz Jaffer to the minbar, can we have the brothers please stand up and move forward and move up. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المذلومين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة، يا غريم يا مذنوم يا عطشان كربلاء، ما خاب من تمسك بكم والعمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي، يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، ولنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين الذين إذا أصابتهم مصيبة قالوا إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلى الله عليه وسلم. Amongst the most difficult and challenging experiences that a human being has to encounter during the course of their life is when they lose a loved one. And we have so much language that we often engage in semantically within our cultures and within our communities to berate someone who has lost an individual whom they loved so dearly. We have words of console that we share with them. We say, Adam Allah ujurakum, may Allah increase you in your reward for the grief that you're enduring. We say, Sabbarakum Allah, that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep you patient. We say, we're here for you. If there's anything we can do for you, feel free to reach out. We're your brother, we're your sister, we're family. And of course, all of these words that we express when someone has lost a loved one undoubtedly impact the heart of the one who is grieving. But at the same time, for any individual, probably every single one of us who have lost someone who is near and dear and close to us, the experience of that moment of loss in the early stages is an experience of shock, an experience of incredible trial, an experience of such difficulty. And many times people, they fail to balance what is their role or their religious responsibility when it comes toward that moment where they're impacted by grief. On one end, so much of our culture and so much of religious tradition emphasizes the importance of being patient. And many people, they struggle with how exactly to be patient at the loss of someone who they're so close with, someone who they loved so dearly, a parent, a grandparent, a spouse, a sibling, a child. How can I be patient when I lost someone who was so close to me? At the same time, they know that within our religious tradition, there is not a total rejection of demonstrating or showing of grief. So they say, when I cry, when I remember, when I recite Quran, when I distribute food in honor of the one that I love, is it such that I am over-exaggerating my grief? Am I not submitting to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? People go through these emotions many a times immediately at the onset of the loss of someone that they love. And within religious traditions, even beyond the religion of Islam, this has been a really common conversation that has manifested itself in many pockets. Religious scholars in Christianity, for instance, have long debated between how someone submits to the decree of God versus at the same time grieving and actualizing the virtues and the etiquette of their honoring of their loved one. I give you the example of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a famous writer, famous scholar. He was English from the UK, and he dies in the year 1962. If you go on Google and you search his name, you'll see that he is an author of dozens upon dozens of books, many of them novels, but in the latter part of his life, he dedicated a lot of his literature toward writing about religious texts and writing about challenges that people within his community, with the Christian community, faced. Amongst the most famous of his works is a book known as The Problem of Pain, which talks about the problem of evil and suffering within religious tradition, which is, by the way, an incredibly seminal and important work. But in his work, known as A Grief Observed, he writes a series of essays after the death of his wife, Helen, who in the course of the book he calls her H, gives her a code name. And he talks about how he was a devout Christian, a believer within his religious tradition. And he knows that when he is supposed to lose someone, he is meant toward submitting toward the decree of God, not being upset, but being prepared, being ready, having to deal with whatever God throws at him. But the moment that he loses his wife, who was diagnosed with a terminal cancer and within a couple of years passes away, he writes in this series of essays, he said that I preached it, and I knew it, and I submitted to it, and I told everyone about how important it is to be patient when they lost a loved one themselves. But the moment when I lost my wife, all of that rhetoric, I threw it into the trash. And I started to wonder, why is God doing this to me? How am I supposed to deal with the tragedy? He even talks about moments where he would go out to a dinner and some people would come to him and offer him condolences months after the death of his wife, while others didn't. And he was mad at the ones who offered him condolences, and he was also upset at the ones who didn't offer him condolences. He was upset with the ones who offered him condolences because they reminded him of his pain. And he was upset at those who didn't offer him condolences, thinking that they didn't care about his pain. He talks about these emotions that, again, many people within our communities also endure. He states that after the loss of my beloved wife, I thought that my faith was as strong as a castle. He said, but I realized that it was as strong as a deck of cards. All God had to do, metaphorically, is blow on it and everything fell to the ground. But toward the end of this series of essays, again, A Grief Observed, and I would strongly recommend everyone to read it as well, he talks about how those moments shaped him and allowed for his solidification of intense faith and conviction in God to also manifest and take place. But throughout the series of these essays that he writes, he's consistently going back and forth with regards toward the practical side of grieving with the theoretical side of grieving. The patience coupled with the tears. Within our own religious tradition, we have a great scholar, often famously known as Ash-Shahid al-Thani, Zayn al-Din al-Amili, who writes a famous work known as Musakkin al-Fu'ad. It's been translated in the English language as a heart's comforter. You can find it on alislam.org, probably on Amazon as well. In which he, after the death of one of his sons, he writes a book where he compiles all of the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, which speak about the permissibility of grieving. Because people would go to the Shaykh and they would see him in this grief and they would say, Shaykh, why are you grieving so much? Don't you know that Hussein ibn Ali had to deal with more than you? Don't you know that Lady Zainab had to deal with everything that she had to deal with? And oftentimes we hear this rhetoric in our community. Someone who is grieving, we say, be patient. Do you know what Zainab had to go through? Be patient. Do you know what Zayn al-Abidin had to go through? When we dismiss someone else's grief and their bereavement at any given moment, number one, that's absolutely not a good practice for the one who is grieving at that moment. But beyond that, as Ash-Shahid al-Thani compiles in this book of traditions, there is actually a practical element toward the show of grief as well. People shouldn't be condemned if at that moment they can't totally control their grief and their tears and their sighs at the loss of someone that they love and that they care about. So for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I want to talk about this concept of grief between balancing the theoretical versus the practical. And I want to break the conversation down into three different dimensions. The first dimension is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about how we should navigate grief within the whole Quran in a very theoretical manner. The second dimension, in terms of how the Quran and the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt speak about expressions of grief in a more practical manner. And then thirdly, the third dimension, in terms of how we can allow for a blend between the theoretical and the practical and creating an environment where people can grieve but also understand the importance of patience in the midst of their grief. Let's jump right into dimension number one of the conversation. The theoretical understanding of how we encounter and how we experience grief is fairly obvious. We always talk within our communities and stress on the importance of patience and patience and patience. And that don't worry, you're going to feel better. Don't worry, it's going to take time. But like we know, when you lose someone that is so near and dear to you, you know that time might help, but time doesn't actually ever allow for that pain that you felt on day one or even years down the road to fade entirely. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say within the whole Quran? He states, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرْ الصَّابِرِينَ. He states, we will undoubtedly try you. We promise that we will try you. And he states it and he utilizes the lam of ta'keed, meaning that he states it with utter and absolute certainty that we are going to put the human being through various trials and tribulations. And then he gives us the recipe. He gives us the examples of how he will undoubtedly try each and every single one of us. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. That we will try you by fear. We will try you by your health. We will try you by your wealth. We will try you by your children. And we will try you by the loss of those whom you love. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that these experiences are normal. These experiences are natural. Some of us will be tried with all of them on a small scale. Some of us will be tried with one of them on a large scale. At the end of the day, that's beyond our understanding. We don't have the capacity to choose. We can't say, oh Allah, test me by my wealth and not by my children. Test me by my children and not by my wealth. Test me by fear and not by food. A whole host of individuals throughout history have probably desired that they were tested a different way than the way that they have been. But at the end of the day, we submit to the decree of Allah Azza wa Jal. And God concludes this ayah by stating, وَبَشِّرْ الصَّابِرِينَ, and glad tidings to the patient ones. At the end of the day, God doesn't say that it will be easy. He doesn't say that you're going to get over it. He doesn't say that any one of us are going to absolutely feel not threatened by the trial that we're going through at that given moment. It's meant to be painstaking. It's meant to hurt. It's meant to be difficult. It's meant to be challenging. But there is some solace. وَبَشِّرَ الصَّابِرِينَ, and glad tidings toward those who are patient. Who are those who are patient? الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. They are those when they encounter this difficulty and when they encounter that trial and tribulation, they say with all conviction and with all faith, to Allah we belong and to Him is our return. What exactly does that mean? Without getting into the philosophy of what inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un means, at the very least what we recognize, it means that we submit in some way to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know that after the tragedy of Karbala, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, Lady Zainab, these members from the prophetic family, they grieved and they wept over the tragedy of Al-Hussein alayhi salam. People come to us today consistently within our communities. They say 1,000+ years later, you still grieve year after year for the tragedy of these members from the family of the Prophet of God. This is going against the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We say, no, my friend, I'm not dismissing that this was out of the decree of Allah Azza wa Jal. We submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If God takes my family, God takes the Prophet, God takes Al-Hussein alayhi salam, I'm not upset with God. But at the end of the day, there's a deeper level of upset that we're feeling. Asbagh bin Nubata, this great companion of Ali alayhi salam, it is said that we often narrate this on the 20th or the 21st of the month of Ramadan, that when Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen was in his final moments, he had his companions and his confidants around him. And then he tells them on the morning or on the eve of the 21st of the month of Ramadan to leave so he can spend time with his family members, his children, his spouse, and so on and so forth. And they all leave and they hear someone crying really loudly outside of the house of Ali. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen looks toward Al-Hassan and he says, oh my son Hassan, go outside and see who's grieving. We told all of the companions to leave. So it is said that he goes outside of the house and he sees Asbagh bin Nubata sitting outside of the house of Ali. Imam al-Hassan says, oh Asbagh, he says, it's time for you to go home. He says, I want one more glance at the face of Ali alayhi salam. He says, you really have to go home because your weeping and your grieving is paining the children and the daughters of Ali alayhi salam. So he says, one more. So he takes him inside. Everyone leaves. Asbagh bin Nubata is sitting next to Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. And he states, Ya Asbagh, la tabki, innaha wallahi jannah. He states, oh Asbagh, don't cry for me. I'm going to paradise. I see it in front of my eyes. And then Asbagh, he responds with this beautiful line. He says, oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, I don't cry because I'm worried about you. I know you're going to paradise. I know you're going to be okay. When someone passes away, what do we call them? We call them marhum, someone who's been enveloped in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm not worried about Ali ibn Abi Talib. But Asbagh, rather, he says, oh Ali, I worry about me. I worry about myself. I worry about what is life like without Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. You and I, we just hear stories about them and we're infatuated with them. Imagine someone who spent time with Ali alayhi salam. So in this verse of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defines those who are patient. الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Those who, when they encounter a difficulty, they know and they submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm not weeping 1,000 years later because I'm angry at God that Hussein alayhi salam was killed. I'm weeping because I wonder what is life like without Hussein ibn Ali salamullah alayhi. And then God, He continues and He speaks about their qualities. أُولَٰئِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ صَلَوَاتٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُهْتَدُونَ. That for these individuals who show that patience and who commit and who submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that for them is this reward that is unmatched, that is unimaginable, that is only with the Lord Himself. And again, this first concept and this first dimension and this first stage of understanding the practical nature of our grief is fairly obvious. We know that we have to be patient. We know that we have to submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what's up with all the rhetoric then? Is it such that we just have to be patient and that years later I can't grieve for the loss of my late mother, father, grandparent, sibling, spouse, child, whatever it might be? And is that a show of me not demonstrating my patience in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The second dimension speaks of a little bit more of a practical nature. The first and the most famous example of this grief that is mentioned is of course the grief of Yaqub over Yusuf alayhi salam. What happens? And what is the demonstration that God gives within the Holy Quran? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He quotes the children of Yaqub, the brothers of Yusuf. After Yusuf alayhi salam, like we know, has been absent from his father for several decades, they state, قالوا تالله تفتأ تذكر يوسف حتى تكون حرضا أو تكون من الهالكين. Number one, they state, "O our father, Yaqub, that this grief that you're showing for your son is way too intense. And we're afraid. We're afraid for you. We're afraid for this grief pulling you so distant from yourself. You're not yourself anymore." Sometimes they tell people who are grieving, they say, "You're not yourself anymore," as if that's a bad thing. When you lose someone, you have the right to not be yourself anymore. You have the right to change. You have the right to grow. You have the right to develop. You have the right to change your perspective. The children of this Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they state that we're afraid you're going to get sick. We're afraid for your health. أَوْ تَكُونَ مِنَ الْهَالِكِينَ. And we're afraid that you might die over the intensity of this grief. Anyone who has experienced the loss of a loved one, that first moment when you hear the news, when you're lowering your loved one into the grave, when you're performing their ghusl, how many individuals can say, "I did not feel like I was not going to die"? Everyone says the same thing. That moment when you hear the news, you can't feel your legs, you can't feel your body, you can't feel your emotions, you don't know what is happening. Just a little while ago, a few hours ago, someone from my community called me and she told me that my mother is in ICU and she's just been intubated and the doctor has told me that she only has, very limited amount of time. And she's weeping and she's crying on the phone. And she says, "I don't feel like this is real. I feel like this is a dream. I hope to just go to sleep and wake up." And then the next question that she said, as she's weeping and she's crying, she says, "I'm doing something wrong, right?" I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "This is your mother. Why would you feel like you're doing something wrong?" And she says, "Because I'm not being patient, right?" And I said, "No, sister. You're doing everything that is normal. You're committing yourself to a normal human reaction. We're going to pray, and we're going to hope, and we're going to do the best that we can. But for you to feel this way, don't worry about your emotion at this given moment." Yaqub alayhi salam had hope that his son Yusuf was still around, was still alive. But they still stated, "Oh, our father, we're so worried about how much you grieve over the distance of your son." At the end of the day, Yaqub alayhi salam says, "I know what I'm doing." And we'll get to that in a moment. One example of this practical manifestation of grief is the grief of Yaqub over the loss of his son Yusuf. A second example is the example of when the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, he loses his son Ibrahim in infancy. It is said that when the Messenger of God loses Ibrahim, who dies at a very young age in the first several months of his life, they come toward Rasulullah and they see him in the state of grief. And they say, "O Messenger of God, you are the one who teaches us about patience. How is it that at this moment we see you overwhelmed with this much grief?" And Rasulullah, he responds with a beautiful line. He says that this heart is burning, and these limbs are in pain, and these eyes will shed tears. But I submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, don't think that just because I'm showing grief, that I don't believe in God, that I'm rejecting the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet, the same people come to us and they say, "Why are you weeping? Why are you grieving?" It was the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wassalam, in his magnanimity, in his greatness, who is the best of all examples. إِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا كَافَةً لِلنَّاسِ. That everything that the Messenger of God does and did suffices humanity. That when he loses the son of his, he states that the limbs are in pain and the heart is on fire, but these eyes will continue to shed tears, but we submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third example, of course, is the example of Ali ibn al-Husayn al-Sajjad, alayhi salatu wassalam. What happens when they come toward him, alayhi salam? They would see him in that state of grief. They would state, "Ya ibn Rasulullah, is it not such that for you martyrdom and death is normal?" To which he would respond, "قَتْلُ لَنَا عَادَةٌ وَكَرَامَةٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ الشَّهَادَةُ." That he states, dying for us is our pastime, and martyrdom for us is an honor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the daughter of the son of the Messenger of God was killed thirsty. The daughter of the son of the Messenger of God was killed hungry. The daughter of the son of the Messenger of God was killed lonely. And he would recite these lines until his food and his drink would be encapsulated by his own tears. Again, we're not saying that Imam Zainul Abidin ever dismissed, again, his grief for his father Hussein, nor did he ever dismiss the fact that it was the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this brings me then to the third dimension. We know that our role and our responsibility is to show patience and to muster up the courage toward holding back our grief sometimes. But then we also see these examples in a more practical state, where even the greatest of the examples of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they demonstrated and they showed and they reflected that sense of pain and grief that they had. When it comes to our experience communally, let me say this with all care and with love, that if we don't know what to say towards someone who is grieving, then let us go back toward the ethos as that which has been taught to us by the Prophet and his family, alayhi salam. When someone has just lost a loved one, don't tell them, "Be patient like Zainab. Be patient like Ali." No. Tell them, "May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep you patient." Because then they begin to compare their own grief toward the grief of the family of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon them. And then they begin to wonder and perhaps self-deprecate and think, "Wait a minute, am I doing something wrong? Because Zainab alayhi salam, she didn't show grief like the way that I am." No. They, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has tested their hearts and they have been raised in the eyes of every one from humanity as a source of example for us. But of course, like we said before, doesn't mean it's not permissible for us to grieve. Doesn't mean it's not permissible for us to show this sense of trial and tribulation that we're encountering. But we find within Islamic tradition that there are multiple things that we can do in order to balance the grief that we are encountering at the loss of a loved one between the sense of practice and theory. The first step that we can take is to seek toward transforming our grief into communication with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How exactly can that take place? We said before that these children of Yaqub, they come to their father and they say, "Oh, our father, that we're worried about you. تفتأ تذكر يوسف حتى تكون حربا أو تكون من الهالكين." Oh, our father, every single time you remember the name Yusuf, you are so overwhelmed with grief that we fear of illness or we fear of your own mortality. How does he respond, alayhi salam? The Prophet of Allah, he responds, قال إنما أشكو بثي وحزني إلى الله وأعلم من الله لا تعلمون. He states that this grief and these tears and these sighs, every time I remember my son, every time we remember our father, our grandfather, our mother, the one that we lost, allow for that to be a conversation between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every time you remember the loss of your loved one, when you grieve for them, you make dua at the same time. Oh Allah, this grief that is so painstaking to this heart of mine, have mercy on my father, have mercy on my mother, raise their station, keep them in the company of Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. What we learn from Yaqub alayhi salam is that he responds to his sons, وَأَعْلَمُ مِنَ اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُ. That I know something between me and God that you don't know. Meaning that these tears and this grief of mine is a dua that I'm making toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every time I remember the legacy, every time I remember the memory of my son Yusuf, salamullah alayhi. So step number one, when we are grieving the loss of our loved one, let us transfer that grief into dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the marhum that we are remembering. A second stage or a second step that we can cultivate within our community is to striving toward, again, fulfilling the example in terms of offering consolation to those who are in a state of bereavement at any given moment. Within the period of Jahiliyyah, in the pre-prophetic period of Islam, that whenever someone would lose a loved one, that it was the custom of the Arabs that they would feed that family for 3 days. That they would feed that family for 3 days, and after the third day, they would give them some time. And it is stated that the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he loved this practice so much, so he instituted it as a practice that the Muslims should also engage in. And we perform this many a times within our own communities. And normally those early days, after the loss of a loved one, while they're very painful and they're very difficult, because they have consolation from family, from community, they're a little bit easier to pass by. But after 1 week passes, and after 2 weeks pass, and after 1 month passes, and after 3 months pass, that pain becomes a little bit more difficult to bear. Because no one is again offering the one who's bereaving any counsel, any console, any more food, any more drink, checking up on them. But again, that's where the believer is different. That they consistently, at least for 1 year, at least for several months, every once in a while, they will say something that will offer some sense of console and comfort toward the one who has lost someone that they love. We have a hadith narrated in Kitab al-Kafi from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam, in which he states, "Man aza thakala adallahu Allahu fi dhilla arshihi yawma la dhillun illa dhilluh." That he states that the one who offers console, the one who offers some kind words toward the individual who has lost a loved one, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will shade them under his throne on that day where there is no shade except for his shade. Meaning that on the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will raise the one who offers consolation to those who perform this deed of saying something as simple as Adam Allah ujurakum. And what exactly does it mean? We said before that when someone passes away, we often greet them, we say, Adam Allah ujurakum, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you in your reward. Why? Because when someone is going through that pain, of that feeling, of that loss of someone who is near and dear and close to them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expiates their sins and raises their rank just because of that pain that they're encountering and they're enduring at that moment. So because of that pain, we say, Adamallah ujurakum, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you in your reward, reminding them also that in this moment of your grief, just remember at the same time that this is the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without saying it directly to them. Because if someone passes away and we say, this is the decree of Allah, don't worry about it, don't grieve, again, it's not offering counsel, you're making someone feel bad. So we have a custom within our tradition that we say, may Allah increase you with your reward, reminding the individual who is grieving that they're being rewarded from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, provided that they remember that this comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The third sort of example that we have within our religious tradition, within our ahadith, is really beautiful. And this is the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His graciousness, out of His kindness, out of His comfort, out of His compassion, out of His love, out of His care, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He Himself aids us in the process of our grief. That moment when you first heard about the loss of your loved one, again, go back to that feeling that struck your heart. You can't feel your legs, your tears are uncontrollable, you can't truly understand what just took place. It's too difficult, it's too hard to hear. That moment of intense pain and of intense grief, on that first day, on that second day, you feel like there's absolutely no way you're not going to feel like this forever. But over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His grace and out of His compassion, He performs an act which supports the believer at their time of loss. Listen to this hadith, also mentioned in Kitab al-Kafi, on the authority of Imam Ja'far bin Muhammad al-Sadiq. And again, my friends, I said this briefly last night, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really cares about our success, and He really cares about His creation. Listen to this hadith. He states, إِنَّ الْمَيِّتْ إِذَا مَاتْ بَعَثَ اللَّهُ مَلِكًا إِلَى أَوْجَعِ أَهْلِهِ فَمَسَحَ عَلَى قَلْبِهِ فَأَنْسَاهُ لَوْءَةَ الْحُزْنِ وَلَوْلَا ذَلِكَ لَمْ تُعْمَرْ الدُّنْيَا. He states that when someone loses someone who is close to them, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appoints an angel to be connected to that person, standing next to that individual. And the angel places their hand on their heart and rubs it, so that once in a while they forget about the grief that they experienced. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not appoint this angel toward the one who is grieving, life could not continue. Because that moment of grief that we have, we feel like life is no longer worth living. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His kindness, knows that we have to be resilient. So He pushes us and He supports us in this path toward resiliency out of His compassion by appointing this angel towards supporting us on this journey. And the fourth practice that was engaged in by the early Muslim community is that whenever we grieve, we also remember the grief of those who had preceded us. Grieving is hard, it's difficult. People can't understand it until they go through those moments. But like we know, those moments in the early get-go, they pass us by, and when someone else is experiencing it, we don't exactly know how it feels because it's not hitting us the same way at that particular moment. But this beautiful practice began in the city of Medina after the passing of the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that was that within the city of Medina, whenever someone had died after the passing of the Prophet, they would go and embrace their Muslim brother, their Muslim sister. And they would say, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you in your reward. Adama Allah ujurakum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep you patient. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raise the rank of your deceased. And then they would say, let us gather together and remember the day when the Messenger of God passed away. So that we transfer this grief that we have at this moment toward becoming an act of worship, because through grieving the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have the opportunity to connect our grief back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a hadith from the Imam alayhi salam which states that when someone loses a loved one and instead they become so infatuated with the Prophet and his family that they remember the loss of the greatest of creations, and that is the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase your patience and increase the reward of the one that you are grieving as well. And immediately after the day of Ashura, we see that this custom begins within our community, that whenever someone loses a loved one, we seek toward transferring our grief to their grief, alayhim as-salam. Which is why that famous hadith from Imam Ali al-Rida, he tells his companion, Rayyan ibn al-Shabib, Ya ibn al-Shabib, in kunta baki'an ala shay, fa'abki ala al-Husayn alayhi as-salam. That, oh son of Shabib, if you're going to grieve over something, then let your grief be for al-Husayn alayhi as-salam. For al-Husayn and his family and his companions. We state that may our mothers and our fathers and our wealth and our children and everything within our authority be in sacrifice for you, O Aba Abdullah. So when we remember the loss of our loved one, we don't dismiss it, but rather we allow for console to be had by weeping over al-Husayn alayhi salam. We lose a child and we remember Ali al-Akbar alayhi salam. We lose a father and we remember the fathers who gave their life on the day of Ashura. We lose a friend and we remember Habib ibn Madahir al-Asadi. Example after example on the day of Ashura that we have toward transferring our grief toward their grief, and all of a sudden we see that this devotion that we have toward Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they allow for the remembrance of our beloved to be etched in their memory. Peace and blessings be upon them, alayhi salam. And this is exactly what we learned from Imam Zain al-Abidin, salamullah alayhi. That every moment, like we said last night, that he had, he would seek toward reminding his community over the tragedy of his father, Abi Abdullah al-Husayn alayhi salam. He would, like we know, he would ask the poets of Medina to recite lines of poetry in honor of the tragedy of al-Husayn. Whenever someone had lost their loved one, he would call someone to recite a majlis for Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. When someone was going through difficulty and going through hardship, he said, let us remember the tragedy and the hardship of my father, Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. Peace and blessings be upon him. Until the last moments of his life, Zain al-Abidin would spend it in weeping and in grieving and in tears over Aba Abdullah. But like we said last night, that when Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, in the final moments of Zain al-Abidin, he was by his side. And after the Imam alayhi salam had taken his last breaths, Imam al-Baqir salamullah alayhi, he takes the body of his father Zain al-Abidin and performs its ghusl. And many years later he narrates that when I was performing the ghusl of my father Zain al-Abidin, I saw 3 types of marks on his body. The first types of marks that I saw on his body were the marks on his palms and on his knees and on his forehead from the long prostrations and sujood that he would engage in. The second marks that I saw on the body of my father Zain al-Abidin were bruises on his back because of the weight that he would carry in the darkness of night, distributing wheat and barley, food and drink to the people of Medina, the widows and the orphans. And then they stated, Yabna Rasulillah. And what was the third marking that you would see on the body of your father Zain al-Abidin? He said, I saw these markings on the neck of my father Zain al-Abidin. I saw it on the ankles of my father Zain al-Abidin. I saw it on the wrists of my father Ali Zain al-Abidin. They would state, Yabna Rasulullah, what are these markings of? They would say that these are from the chains and these are from the shackles of the journey of my father Ali from Karbala to Kufa and from Kufa to Damascus. My friends, what we have when it comes toward the tragedy of Ahlul Bayt after the day of Ashura are only small glimpses into what they had to endure and what they had to experience. But I say, oh Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, you were there, you were able to perform the ghusl, you were able to perform the burial of your father, you were able to place his body into the graveyard of Al-Baqi. But there was one man who was, when he was performing the ghusl of his beloved, he was unable to do it without showing too much emotion. Who was that? For when Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam was performing the ghusl of his wife Fatima al-Zahra, when he was washing that body, it is said that his hand touches over the rib of his wife Fatima al-Zahra. It is said that after he completes the ghusl, he exits from the room and he enters into his home and he sees Asma. Asma goes toward him and says, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, from you we learn patience. From you we learn not to show grief. Why do I see you in this state?" At this moment, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen says, I don't know what my hands touched except for the broken rib of Fatima al-Zahra. How can you blame me for what I am grieving over when I saw and when I experienced exactly what she had to go through? Salamullah alayha. Ala la'natullah ala al-qawm al-zalimin. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with grief in our hearts and with tears in our eyes. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for us to be blessed with the life that resembles the life of Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad, and the death that resembles the death of Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to never separate us from them in this world or in the next. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon all of our marhumeen and grant them in the company of Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us their ziyarah in this life and their shafa'ah in the next life. Birahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. وصل اللهم على محمد وآله الطاهرين. اللهم صل على ماتم حسين.
Ya Hussein, 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 Ya Hussein,
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. हो सलाम उस पर के जो कैदी भी है बीमार भी. हो सलाम उस पर के जो कैदी भी है बीमार भी. हो सलाम उस पर के जो कैदी भी है बीमार भी. हो सलाम उस पर के जो कैदी भी है बीमार भी. पाँव में है आबले और आबलों में खार भी. हो सलाम उस पर के जो कैदी भी है बीमार भी. हो सलाम उस पर के जो कैदी भी है बीमार भी. आँख में आंसू और जख्म जिगर में, होंठों पे दागा नोहा. कर्बला से हर शाम तलक वो कांटों पे सफर करता था. बेरदा सरदानिया उस पर सितम बाजार भी. हो सलाम उस पर के जो قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ دیکھنے والی آنکھوں نے دیکھا اس راہ میں یہ بھی منظر، ایک مسافر پابند سفر ہے، خود اپنی لاش اٹھا کر یہ امام وقت ہے، اور قافلہ سالار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ خون رگوں کا یا غیرت ہاشم کہتی ہے جھکا لے سر کو سلاسل کیا قید کریں گے، ہے صبر کے اس پہ کر کو سر اٹھائے کس طرح، ہے راہ میں بازار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ دیکھ کے زینب سجاد کی حالت فریاد یہی کرتی تھی، میرا یقین ہے ایمان ہے میرا، اے شام کے بے قص قیدی روئیں گے تجھ پر صدا، مسند بھی اور دستار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ بیٹھا کہیں پر جب تھک کے مسافر 40 شبوں کا جاگا، نیند جو آئی بے کس قیدی کو، دروں سے جگایا جاتا دیکھ کر رویا فلک، اور زینب لاچار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ نو کی سنا پر ہے باپ کا سر ہے، اس بات پہ دل بے قابو، بے چادر ہے ناموس پیمبر، ماحول شرابی ہر سو خون روئے ساربا، اور سید ابرار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ پاؤں میں ہے آبلے اور آبلوں میں خار بھی، ہو سلام اس پر کہ جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی، ہو سلام اس کر کے جو قیدی بھی ہے بیمار بھی۔ یا حسین
کہتی تھی ماں خون بھری میت لپٹ کر، ہے علی اکبر، ہے علی اکبر، کہتی تھی ماں خون بھری میت لپٹ کر، ہے علی اکبر، ہے علی اکبر، کہتی سے لپٹ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ارمان تا پہناؤں گی پوشاک شہانی ارمان تا پہناؤں گی پوشاک شہانی افسوس کی رسائی نہ تجھ کو یہ جوانی کیسا تھا مقدر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر کہتی تھی ماں ہوں بھری میں چل پکڑ ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ماں تیری جدائی میں بلا کیسے جیے گی ماں تیری جدائی میں بلا کیسے جیے گی مر جائے گی سغرا جو خبر تیری سنے گی اب کیا کروں دل بر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے علی اکبر کہتی تھی ماں ہوں بھری میں سے لپٹ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر پہلے تو ایک آواز پہ اٹھ جاتے تھے بیٹا پہلے تو ایک آواز پہ اٹھ جاتے تھے بیٹا اب اتنی صداؤں پہ بھی پہلو نہیں بدلا کیا ہو گیا دل بر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے علی اکبر کہتی تھی ماں ہوں بھری میں سے لپٹ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر تم ہچکیاں لے لے کے جو دم توڑ رہے ہو تم ہچکیاں لے لے کے جو دم توڑ رہے ہو منہ سے ہمیشہ کے لیے مور رہے ہو کیوں روٹے ہو دل بر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر تھی ماں ہوں بھری میت سے لپٹ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر آئے جو ہمیں لوٹنے خیمے میں ستمگر آئے جو ہمیں لوٹنے خیمے میں ستمگر ماں دے گی صدائے علی اکبر علی اکبر چھن جائے گی چادر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر کہتی تھی ماں ہوں بھری میت سے لپٹ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر جب کوئی جوان لاش نظر آتی ہے محشر جب کوئی جوان لاش نظر آتی ہے محشر ایک یاد سوئے کرب و بلا جاتی ہے محشر دل روتا ہے کہہ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر کہتی تھی ماں ہوں بھری میت سے لپٹ کر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر ہائے ہائے علی اکبر
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام على رسول الله، السلام على أمير المؤمنين، السلام على فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، السلام على أبا محمد الحسن، السلام على أبا عبد الله، السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام على علي بن الحسين السجاد، السلام على محمد بن علي الباقر، السلام على جعفر بن محمد الصادق، السلام على موسى بن جعفر الكاظم، السلام على علي بن موسى الرضا، السلام على محمد بن علي الجواد، السلام على علي بن محمد الهادي، السلام على حسن بن علي العسكري، السلام عليك يا حجة بن الحسن المهدي، أجر الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله تعالى مخرجه. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.